I dropped out of school to support my boyfriend Shawn Carter through his Ph.D. But after he achieved success, he cheated on me with a female student and divorced me after a car accident. I was reborn. Returning to the day I decided to drop out of school, I stormed into the principal's office and said firmly, "Sir, I'm not dropping out." The principal adjusted his glasses and looked at me. "You're Emily Brown, right? Fine, you can stay, but first you'll need to pay the outstanding tuition and fees." He glanced disdainfully at my faded school uniform and added sarcastically, "When you see the entrance exam, we thought we were bringing in a golden phoenix. Who would have guessed that in just months you'd plummet from first place to while." The principal continued his tirade. My grandmother Helen burst into the room, carrying a large woven sack. Without a word, she began shoving all my belongings into it, declaring, "If she's not going to school, these can be sold to the recycling station." The principal smirked and remarked, "Mrs. Brown, that's not the best way to phrase it. And about the tuition, Emily was in the top for the entrance exam. We only waived the fees because of that." My grandmother retorted, "You waived the fees because she was supposed to get into a top university. Now she can barely qualify for a decent community college. Back in middle school I had excelled, achieving top scores, but high school was different. The curriculum was harder and success required both talent and time. While other students attended evening study sessions, I worked night shifts at a convenience store. While they went to early morning classes, I delivered milk. All the money I painstakingly saved was spent by my so-called brother Jake on video games, as my grandmother and the principal argued they completely ignored me. I grabbed the sack from her hands. "I'm not dropping out," I shouted. Helen, who had just been scolding the principal, turned her wrath on me. "What do you mean you're not dropping out? Your father just died. We have no income and your brother still needs to go to school. What are you going to do? Be as unlucky as your dead mother?" Furious, I shouted back, "Jake isn't even my real brother. You brought him here to maintain some imaginary family legacy. You don't even care if your own granddaughter goes to school." My voice was loud enough to attract attention. Teachers from the neighboring math department gathered at the door, intrigued by the unfolding drama. Helen's lips trembled with rage. "Are you trying to kill me?" she cried. I shot back, "You seemed perfectly healthy when you hit me yesterday." I realized that if I wanted to stay in school, my only option was to expose the truth. High school students usually have too much pride to show their struggles, but I wasn't the same anymore. A nightmare like decade had taught me that survival mattered more than dignity. I knelt in front of my grandmother, pulling up my sleeves to reveal red welts on my arms. "You're forcing me to drop out and marry some old man for his money. You mean that 40-year-old Joe Miller who can't even feed himself?" "I won't do it. Please just let me stay in school. If I get into college, I promise I'll support this family." In my previous life I dropped out, was forced into marriage, and ran away after injuring Joe. I stole an ID card and fled to the city where everyone assumed I was working in a factory. Only Shawn Carter found me delirious with fever, desperate for love. I believed his lies, worked 2 jobs to support him, and helped him get into South University. Why couldn't I go to college for myself? Supporting a selfish man had been pointless. This time I was determined to fulfill all the dreams I had abandoned and make those who exploited me pay. The teachers, stunned by my story, didn't expect me to be so pitiful. Mr. Harris, the teacher who had recommended me for special admission, stepped forward. "Emily has been through so much," he said as he helped me up. Glaring at my grandmother, he continued, "Mrs. Brown, our school provided in financial aid for Emily to enroll, and now you want her to drop out." I had never heard about the before. Helen shifted uncomfortably under the judgmental stares of the teachers. She muttered, "Girls grow up and get married anyway. Isn't it better for them to have a husband who knows how to take care of them?" Mr. Harris snapped, "Joe Miller is 24 years old. Emily is only 16. What you're doing is illegal." Faced with mounting criticism, my grandmother finally relented. Fine, she won't drop out, but I'm not paying the tuition fees." I breathed a sigh of relief, but my grandmother Helen quickly grabbed my arm and pulled me aside. "If you want to go to school, you figure it out yourself. Don't expect a single penny from this family." Her expression was fierce as she stormed off, leaving me standing there. Mr. Harris stepped protectively between us, watching her leave, but I was now alone, facing an office full of teachers. The principal seemed to snap out of his moment of sympathy, realizing the situation. "Wait a minute," he said, as if suddenly recalling something important. "She still owes tuition and fees. This isn't something we've dealt with before. If the debt isn't paid, it falls on the administration to sort out." Mr. Harris, undeterred, spoke up. "We'll waive whatever can be waived. I'll personally cover the rest," he said, patting my shoulder reassuringly. Turning to the principal, I asked, "If I manage to get into Harvard, can the remaining fees be waived?" The principal, who was in the middle of taking a sip of water, nearly spat it out. Harvard, are you serious? This school considers it a miracle if we get a single student into a top-tier university like MIT, and you're talking about Harvard. I wasn't able to study before because I didn't have time, I explained, but his skeptical look made it clear he didn't believe me. Fine, he said, shaking his head. Next week's final exams will tell the truth. Take a look at your scores before you start making such bold claims. Even Mr. Harris seemed doubtful, though he tried to encourage me. Emily, don't stress about the fees. If you really feel guilty, you can repay me after you graduate and start working. I nodded silently. I knew that proving myself would be the only way to change their minds. Go back to class and tidy up your things, Mr. Harris said with a gentle smile when I entered the classroom. It was the middle of break and the room was as lively as a marketplace, but as soon as I dragged the woven sack into the doorway, the noise stopped and everyone stared at me like they had pressed pause on a remote. I walked over to my old seat, but someone else was sitting there. It was Dylan Reed, a boy who fancied himself the class comedian but more like a cheap knockoff. His face twisted in annoyance as I approached, and he gestured to the desk, which was covered with his tattered books literally falling apart. Why are you back? He sneered. With your grades, you might as well drop out. You couldn't even get into a community college. I looked at him calmly. Move your stuff. Dylan clearly wasn't expecting me to talk back. His face turned red with anger. If you're dropping out, then do it already. Go get a job and save yourself the tuition. The room erupted in laughter. The humiliation of a former top student like me seemed to bring them an extra dose of joy. Smear my reputation. Without fighting back, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Lindsay and her friends growing visibly nervous. You with a score of 25 in English dare to say you're better than Shawn? Mr. Gordon grabbed the grade sheet and flung it at me, the bold 25 glaring back at me in black ink. I stared at it, then lifted my head. Fine, I said, my voice leaden. Wait for the finals, see for yourself. Anyone can talk big, Mr. Gordon sneered. If your English score doesn't meet the standard, you won't stay in this class. You'll be sent to the regular track. A challenge had been laid down and I had no choice but to take it. Looking at the pristine English textbooks on my desk, my heart wavered. It had been so long since I studied properly. Could I really pull this off? As I tapped my foot anxiously, Brian White, sitting beside me, frowned slightly. Can you stop moving? Sorry, I said sheepishly, then quickly followed up. Since you're already annoyed, can I borrow your study materials? Brian didn't respond but pushed a set of books toward me. The textbooks were immaculate, like they'd been prepared to sell to the next batch of students. I opened one, flipping to the table of contents. The modules were neatly divided. The purple sections were for second-round review for seniors, and the red sections were for first-round review. Each module included multiple-choice questions, reading comprehension, and task-based reading exercises. Are you actually reviewing or just flipping through books? Lindsay's mocking voice rang out from across the room. Others, noticing how quickly I was turning pages, joined in the laughter. Is this the legendary quantum reading method? Someone joked. She's reading a book in 25 seconds flat. I think 2050 suits you better, someone mocked. But I ignored it, focusing on the book in front of me. In English, vocabulary is king. During my time working as a waitress to earn extra money, I had picked up conversational fluency in 2 languages. While I might not be great with grammar, my vocabulary was decent. Everyone knows that English comprehension is a bit like a guessing game. If Shawn Carter had claimed I asked him for help with math, I might have been at a loss. But English? Not likely. As I was lost in thought, Brian White suddenly kicked the table lightly, silencing the room. Can you all shut up? He said, his voice cold and cutting. Lindsay Chin, who had been sneering at me, froze like a duck whose neck had been squeezed. Her face turned red with embarrassment. Being rebuked by the class's golden boy wasn't something she could brush off. Fighting back tears, she ran out of the room, presumably to complain to the homeroom teacher. I let out a quiet laugh. Did she really think the teacher would confront Brian? Brian suddenly broke the silence. I thought you didn't have a problem with me, he said, his voice calm but probing. Do you think I'm some kind of bully? His perceptiveness caught me off guard. I quickly shook my head. Of course not. I've just been having a toothache, that's all, I replied with a forced smile, hoping he wouldn't press further. He said nothing, but I took the opportunity to help tidy up his desk, arranging his books and pens meticulously. Don't worry. When you sleep, I won't bother you, I assured him. In my past life, my brief interactions with Brian, whether in the classroom or when he had helped me in the restaurant, had given me some insight into his preferences. I knew how he liked his books stacked and his pens placed. As I worked, Brian seemed like he wanted to stop me but hesitated. We have similar habits when it comes to organizing things, he finally said, his voice almost awkward like he was making small talk. The faintest trace of color crept up his cheeks. I didn't mean anything by that. I know, I said with a genuine smile. I believe you. He said nothing more, but his silence spoke volumes. That moment I didn't realize just how much my words, "I believe you," meant to him. As expected, the homeroom teacher, Mr. Gordon, didn't reprimand Brian. Lindsay returned, still sniffling, but kept her distance, clearly avoiding further humiliation. The rest of the evening passed smoothly. My first evening self-study session since being reborn felt strangely satisfying. I even found myself reciting passages from the Ballad of the Pea Player, the melancholic tone of the poem oddly fitting my situation. But reality hit hard once classes ended. Unlike the other students, I didn't have a dormitory. I had to go back home. Our old 600-square-foot apartment in the rundown part of town was the only valuable thing my father had left us. The master bedroom was occupied by my so-called brother, Jake Brown. The second bedroom belonged to my grandmother. As for me, I slept in a tiny makeshift room in the living room. When I got home, it was already late. The house was filled with the sound of a girl's sweet laughter from Jake's computer. Double kill. The game announcer blared. After taking a quick shower, I had just stepped into my cramped little space when Jake emerged from his room. His greasy hair was dyed a sickly yellow, and he was panting after just a few steps, his overweight body glistening with sweat. His eyes darted to places they shouldn't, making my skin crawl. "Give me $500, he demanded, his voice grating. "I need to buy a new skin for my game character." As he said the word skin, he even licked his lips. "Your skin's not bad already," he added, his tone sleazy as he reached out a chubby hand toward me. I slapped his hand away. "Are you insane?" I snapped. "Try that again and I'll break your hand." One simple decision, not dropping out of school, seemed to have triggered a butterfly effect, unraveling years of pent-up tension. "What are you afraid of?" Jake sneered, stepping closer. "It's not like we're related by blood." He lunged at me, trying to cover my mouth. But before he could touch me, my grandmother appeared out of nowhere. Grabbing a table lamp, she smashed it against the back of Jake's head with a loud crack. Jake collapsed, groaning in pain, struggling to get back up. But his bulk betrayed him, his attempts to move only making his flesh jiggle as he whimpered. "What the hell are you doing, hitting your brother?" My grandmother shouted, completely ignoring what had just happened. Without even asking for an explanation, she stormed toward me and grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. I waited. I called the police. Yes. I reported Jake Brown as a stranger I didn't know. The moment my grandmother, Helen, heard me on the phone, she panicked, scrambling to grab my phone but falling flat on the floor in the process. "What kind of horrible luck is this? How could you do this? If you get your brother arrested, how am I supposed to live? How can I face your father?" She wailed, her voice shrill. Jake, still dazed from the blow, stumbled toward me, reaching for my phone. I sidestepped him and bolted down the stairs, not stopping until I reached the building entrance. I waited there, heart pounding, until the police arrived. 2 officers approached, calm, professional, and accompanied me back upstairs. As soon as we entered the apartment, Jake started groaning, pretending to be gravely injured. One of the officers asked me gently, "Is this the person you were talking about?" "Yes," I replied, my voice trembling as I clung to my performance. "I'm so scared of him. I don't even know who he is." Blocking my light out of the corner of my eye, I spotted the principal walking past the classroom, monitoring the exams. Mr. Gordon's actions had already crossed the line of permissible behavior, and the principal quietly reprimanded him for disturbing the students. Feeling vindicated, I focused on my test, finding it surprisingly smooth sailing. Moments later, a crumpled piece of paper landed on my desk. I glanced up just in time to catch Mr. Gordon glaring at me as he stormed off. "Ah, I knew you'd cheat," he muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. Before I could say a word in defense, he grabbed my test paper. "You think the lab cameras aren't recording? We'll deal with this after the exam." He turned to the class, holding up the paper. "Who threw the answers? Be smart, fess up now." The classroom fell silent, tension thick in the air. Mr. Gordon's frustration mounted, and soon 3 other grade supervisors arrived. After collecting the test papers, we were told to remain in the room while the surveillance footage was reviewed. It didn't take long for the culprit to be revealed. The girl with the bob haircut had thrown the note, and her round face was now pale with fear. She kept glancing at me as if the word accomplice were written across her forehead. Her pitiful acting could have earned her a spot in the worst historical dramas. I sighed and raised my hand. It was her, Mr. Gordon. She's the one who tried to pass the answers to me. I made a mistake trusting her. The girl's voice was unexpectedly loud as she jumped up, shouting, "It was her. She asked me to pass the answers." I hadn't anticipated her playing the victim so brazenly. Before the exam, the two of them had indeed been whispering conspiratorially. Mr. Gordon seized the opportunity to reprimand me further. "Emily Brown, I never thought you'd stoop to cheating. Of all the students in the academic track, you're the first to do something like this." Tears streaming down her face, the bob-haired girl wailed, "Just admit it. If we confess, the teacher won't punish us too harshly." "Who gave you the right to frame me?" I asked coldly, fixing her with an icy glare. "I don't even know who you are." I pointed to the evidence. "Everything is right here. How dare you still deny it?" Mr. Gordon looked triumphant, his expression akin to a scientist confirming a long-held theory. His face flushed with self-righteous certainty as he declared, "You're bad at studying and your character is even worse." But I wasn't about to back down. "I have evidence too," I said firmly, flipping to the last question on my test. "This question about moving points. I don't believe the person who threw that cheat sheet could have solved it. Look at them. They're from the lower-ranked group. I don't buy that they could answer this." The grade supervisor stepped in to review the situation. Sure enough, my solution to the last question was written out in full detail, while the cheat sheet only contained answers to basic multiple choice and fill-in-the-blank questions. "Why would I need their answers if I can solve a problem like this?" I added confidently. "Then why didn't you answer the earlier questions?" the supervisor asked, catching a potential inconsistency. "I didn't have time," I said without hesitation. The truth was I'd only reviewed moving point problems during my prep sessions. I hadn't even glanced at other topics. And it was thanks to Brian's offhand explanation that I had finally understood this type of question. He really was like a hidden genius. "I can write it again for you right now," I offered. Noticing Mr. Gordon's hesitation, I grabbed a pen and strode to the blackboard. I began solving the problem in front of everyone, narrating each step as I wrote. The girl with the round face who had been trying to frame me was stunned into silence. She had assumed I was only capable of scoring low on a test. "Now, do you want to explain why you tried to frame me?" I asked, turning to her. She was quickly escorted out, but not before implicating others. Lindsay Chon and unexpectedly Brian White were also questioned. Brian, however, returned quickly. "I'm sorry for dragging you into this," I said, feeling genuinely apologetic. "It's not your fault," Brian replied with a slight shake of his head. It was then that I learned the full story. The round-faced girl had a crush on Brian, and Lindsay had manipulated her into believing that I was shamelessly pursuing him. That misunderstanding had fueled her actions against me. "If it weren't for me, you wouldn't have failed your math test," Brian said, his voice tinged with guilt. His eyes even reddened slightly. And while his handsome face made the sight almost poetic, it was clearly abnormal. "That's the victim-blaming fallacy," I said, trying to comfort him. "You can't blame yourself for what others do. That's like blaming a tree for being knocked down by the wind." Brian's eyes softened as I continued. "I trust you. I always have." I repeated the words he had once said to me in another life, giving them back to him. Hearing his low, steady voice again made my face inexplicably warm. Why do I keep thinking about Brian? I wondered. It must be because he's so good-looking. I quickly brushed off the thought, focusing instead on the scene around us. No one seemed to notice my flushed cheeks as everyone's attention was on Dylan Reed, who was animatedly recounting how Mr. Gordon had been reprimanded. Apparently, the principal had reviewed the surveillance footage and scolded Mr. Gordon for hovering around me during the exam, accusing him of poor proctoring and bias. With that bit of good news, the English exam arrived. I casually reported Dylan's use of his phone to cheat, a small act of revenge that left me feeling quite pleased. However, my good mood was short-lived. Just before entering the exam room, Shawn Carter appeared, blocking my path. "I'll speak to the teachers on your behalf," he said, his tone serious, before walking away without waiting for a response. His presumptuousness made my blood boil. What does he mean by that? I fumed. Does he think I'm doomed to fail? Fueled by frustration, I entered the exam room with renewed determination. Filled with a burning intensity that made even the sunlight seem dim by comparison, I chuckled awkwardly, trying to deflect. We're about to enter senior year. No time for misunderstandings. To prevent further questioning, I jokingly invited Brian to help me back Jake. Brian reluctantly agreed, though his mood seemed unusually off that day. Please let me go. Don't hit me anymore. Jake's cries echoed through the alley as we left him lying in a heap. Footsteps sounded in the distance and Brian grabbed my hand, pulling me away quickly. I couldn't stop laughing. That was so satisfying. Thanks, Brian. You're welcome, he replied, his eyes sparkling as he glanced at me. But just as quickly, his usual calm demeanor returned, like a mask falling back into place. Time passed. Finals came and went, and soon we graduated and started college. I'm waiting for you to explain this misunderstanding, Brian said as we finalized the number of tutoring sessions in the schedule. I rented an apartment and packed my daily review sessions with tasks, leaving almost no gaps. Effort determines your baseline. Talent defines your ceiling. Getting into a school like Tsinghua isn't something you can just wish for. It requires deliberate action. Before I knew it, summer vacation ended and the new semester began. I had prepared a parting gift for Brian. We won't be desk mates next semester, so here's something for you, I said, handing it over. Brian looked up from his papers and tapped his test sheet. I didn't prepare any farewell gifts. You getting into a top-tier university will be the best gift for me. I smiled at him like a proud mother, trying to hide how pleased I was. Sure. You're like an old man now, I teased. Brian reached out and ruffled my hair. The next day, to my surprise, I ran into Brian in Mr. Harris's class. My dad's donating another building to the school, he explained casually. Might as well use the privileges while I have them. He unfolded a math test sheet and pushed it toward me. Solve these if you can, they're not easy. You paid for another custom M test, didn't you? I muttered, already drawn to the challenge. Math is a subject that rewards time and effort. What you put in is what you get out. I couldn't resist seeing where I stood, so I dove in immediately. Escaping Mr. Gordon's class was a blessing. In Mr. Harris's class, Brian and I studied under a more self-directed model. While the class material was less intense than the elite track, Mr. Harris encouraged independent study, setting tasks for us to complete on our own and offering targeted help during evening sessions. The approach suited me perfectly and I watched my grades climb steadily. Each exam brought me closer to catching up with Shawn Carter. What thrilled me even more was seeing Brian's progress. His scores were improving just as consistently, and his support kept me motivated. Serena recited my rankings from the last 3 exams as if they were a chant. You're rising faster than a rocket. How is this even possible? I'm just lucky to sit in front of a genius, I joked, but her admiration was genuine. 66th place is nothing, chimed in Lindsay Chan, always quick to inject negativity. You've got a long way to go if you want to catch up to me. Even in our own classroom, there were always people who couldn't resist being spiteful. Why don't you keep your comments to yourself, Lindsay? Serena shot back. And you, Lindsay's little minion, what's your rank, huh? Zoe Reed, Lindsay's short-haired sidekick, smirked. At least I don't brag about going to Tsinghua when I've only managed 66th place. I may not make it to Tsinghua, I replied calmly, but I'm still leagues ahead of you. I turned to Lindsay. How about a bet? Next exam, whoever ranks lower has to stand at the school gate and shout, "I'm a loser," 3 times. Lindsay hesitated. Her grades were good enough to know my rapid progress was a real threat. Afraid? I teased, using just enough goading to bait her. Who's afraid of you? She snapped. Fine, a bet's a bet. Pulling Serena along, I walked back into the classroom. Brian was still napping at his desk, looking far more refreshed than he had in previous semesters. At least now he could stay awake in class. Serena, clearly still fuming from Zoe's snarky comments, buried herself in solving problems, her gossip forgotten. You're definitely going to surpass Shawn Carter this time, Brian said softly, his voice calm but certain. He knew better than anyone how hard I'd been pushing myself. I had compressed 2 years of high school coursework into 1 semester, planning my time so rigorously that even drinking water was scheduled. I won't fail, I said firmly. I couldn't afford to, not with the college entrance exams on the horizon. The mock exam will be brutal, but I'm ready. Beating Shawn is my main goal. Taking down Lindsay is just a bonus. I clenched my fists in